Hey there, and welcome back to the Total Potential Podcast. It's Cole. It has been a minute since we have been together, and I'm super grateful to be back today with an awesome guest, Victor Pierantoni. He is the founder of Zen Stoic. Um, these philosophies of Zen and Stoicism have been super influential in his work. I cannot wait to dive into them today. Um, and he has a concept around emotional debt that I just think, who has a lot of potential for anyone listening. And I just can't wait to share it with you. So let's go ahead and get started. Victor is a coach. He is a lifelong martial artist. He has been working in the coaching space for many years, coaching, hundreds of clients, thousands of coaching hours. His tactics, to say that they are proven and get results is, an understatement. And so we have a lot to learn from him. I'd like to welcome Victor to the podcast. Victor, thanks so much for being here with us today. I'm super excited to have a chance to share a conversation with you.
Yeah, me too. This is awesome to be here and glad that we got connected.
Yeah, me too. It's been such a cool, path doing this podcast, actually, getting to just meet really cool and remarkable people that get to share. I don't know, it's been really a gift to be able to do it and share it with our audience. So I'm grateful to have you here.
Likewise.
Um, okay, before we dive into, some of the things I'm really excited about the work that you do to share with our audience, can you tell us a little bit about, what led you into the coaching space, kind of down this path of self-development? Like, what are some of the foundational things that happened in your life that even led you to do this work?
Yeah, so it's it can be a super long story depending on which aspects of it I tell. But I would say like the very, very beginning, the first moment of inception was actually when my mom passed away when I was 7 years old.
Mm.
And that event in my life really propelled me into a very different direction than I probably would have gone in. And I think what was interesting about it is that it was this moment where I kind of learned that, life can sometimes be unfair, right? And I use that in quotations on purpose because typically things happen in such like divine perfection, but we never realize it in that moment, right? We never
Yeah.
like it always seems unfair or unjust. So when that happened, it just kind of changed the way that I looked at everything. And for years after that, I remember being a victim of my own emotions. Like I felt like I was a prisoner in my own mind with some of the thoughts that I would have because I would entertain things like the question where I'd ruminate on, which is like, why did this happen to me? Like, why did I not get to grow up with a mom? So I'd always kind of ruminate on this. And things really started to change when I had moved to Canada to work for my grandfather in his electronics factory. Now, I was basically doing like general labor and I didn't get to talk, which is, anybody who knows me now is like, if you make me not talk for 8 hours a day, I'm going to get all like wound up. So I had like this one saving grace in that job, which was like my little green iPod Nano.
Mm.
And on that, I had a single book. And it was the first audiobook I ever owned. And a friend of mine gave it to me before I moved. And it was the Four Agreements,
Mm.
which is like still to this day one of my favorites. And in the Four Agreements, it really started to help me create like personal freedom within myself. Getting away from being a victim to my own thoughts. And the first agreement was this idea of being impeccable with your word. In other words, like using your words in service of yourself and others rather than against yourself and others. So this was really important for like my whole self-talk and how I treated myself internally. Fast forward, a year or two when I was in university, one of my best friends that I met there, him and I would always vent to each other about all of the trials and tribulations that it was to be a college student and being
Yeah.
misunderstood by your parents and all that. so we would kind of go back and forth. And then one day he was venting in a particularly intense way. Like he was really suffering over what he was talking about. And he was born with a mild case of cerebral palsy. And what I mean is like when you're talking to him, you would never be able to tell, but when he's walking, you can see kind of like this limp in his leg. And he was basically saying this phrase over and over. He's saying, my left leg is my curse. My left leg is my curse. And I didn't have any coaching skills at the time. But what I did remember is like, he is not using his word in service of himself or others.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So I'm like, okay. So I asked him this question that completely changed his life. And I said, what if your left leg wasn't your curse? What if your left leg was your gift? What if it makes you who you are? And his whole world like turned around. Like he went from not being able to do a body weight squat to, squatting with a barbell and a plate on each side. He ended up, he was not a great student, not because he wasn't intelligent, but he was not interested in anything there. And he ended up dropping out and becoming an entrepreneur. And one of his businesses did over $1 million in 6 months. And so he just like found himself in this question and like looking at this gift rather than a curse. And
Yeah.
so when I noticed the results of like what happened from just a change in his perception of himself, I'm like, what was that? Like, what happened there? Like, is that a job I can do? Can I do
Right?
that for other people? And so I just started like on this pursuit because I had no idea what a life coach was at the
Yeah.
time, or like that was a thing. And so I just started digging and digging, and I built this obsession around being able to help others. And I went from originally being a personal trainer to, realizing that it wasn't fitness that I cared about. It was the opportunity to help somebody see themselves in a different light so that they could be free within themselves. So that's like the beginning inception of how this
Yeah.
journey started.
It's incredible. What a cool experience that you have this point in time that highlighted a gift. And I love that it was a question, because I always say curiosity is just a superpower. Like if you can just get curious about, the things we tell ourselves, a whole different reality is available. So it's so cool that that came from that one experience. What is it about Zen and Stoicism that attracted you so much or influenced the way that you work?
Yeah, so great question, because these two philosophies, I mean, one's from East, one's from West, and in some ways they complement each other, and in other ways they contradict each other.
Hmm.
And for me, my interest for them really like came online when I was working over at Tony Robbins. And while I was working there, that was like my dream job. Like that's where I ended up, getting my opportunity to really build my experience and build my skill set. And it was an incredible program that they have going over there with just an amazing culture, great clients, and everything. So I had the opportunity to really like build my skill set. And at the same time, that dream job started to really like wear on me because it got to a point where I was coaching like 95 people at a time. Like I would just, because, me wanting to be the person that everybody could depend on. I'm like, sure, yeah, bring me more
Yeah.
clients. Go ahead. And so at that point, I'm on the phone for like 8 or 9 hours a day, just talking through people's challenges and about their goals and the stuff that they're going through. And eventually I just realized that I started to become really unmotivated and
Hmm.
couldn't really like hear myself think. So I thought to myself, I was like, okay, well, I need something that's not what I'm teaching every day. So like something outside of like this organization. And so I turned to Zen for meditation. I felt, okay, this could quiet my mind. And then I turned to Stoicism because one of my clients had recommended it, that it had really helped him with structuring his thinking in a more rational and reasonable way so that, he could work through his emotions more effectively. So I was like, okay, those sound great. So I started this little routine where I would read a page of The Daily Stoic by Ryan Holiday every day. And I would meditate for like, 10, 15 minutes or so. And I'd do some visualization, but then, some quiet Zen meditation. And this routine just like really allowed me to operate at my best every day. And then inevitably, everything that I was reading was Zen and Stoicism started like kind of coming out in my sessions and like really like helping people make these transformations. And I was just like, wow, there's really something here. And so eventually I was like, all right, I need to, take this and run with it. So I originally started my podcast, and my first podcast is called the Zen Stoic Podcast. And that was the first rendition of it. And that was just me kind of exploring and learning about these things and then sharing what I was learning. But as I started to work with it more and more in coaching, I just started noticing the impact of it was much greater than some of the other tools that I had learned in the past. So I ended up bringing the two of them together in this hybrid philosophy designed for the modern age to help whoever's practicing it to create unshakable inner peace within themselves.
Hmm. I love that. Just that phrase alone, unshakable inner peace. there's something about that that sounds very chosen, because I think it's easy to, recognize that the world around us doesn't always conform to unshakable peace.
Correct.
um, that's really beautiful. Are there, I mean, I've practiced many types of meditation, many types of breath work. Are there specifics about Zen meditation that you have found especially helpful or useful in your own experience, and in your coaching work?
Mhm. Yeah. So Zen meditation typically goes by the name Zazen, which is just like a regular seated meditation. And ultimately, it's just a stillness practice. It's a quietness of mind that allows you to really come down into the present moment and be able to observe your thoughts as they pass by, not necessarily try to control them, but observe them. And it can be done with eyes closed or eyes open. I like to do both, but ultimately, it just allows your mind to be still. And I'm not trying, like, what's interesting about it is I've talked about this before on the podcast, probably a few times, but meditation it can be an activity that is purposely purposeless, where
Hmm.
you're just there to sit and like be exactly where you are. And what I find really interesting in Zen is that Zen is to be perfectly and simply human without keeping an eye on yourself, without having to keep an eye on yourself, so to speak. It's like when you're hungry, eat. When you're tired, sleep. When you want to sit, sit. That's Zen. It's very
Hmm.
simple and not based on doctrines or beliefs or anything like that, but just based on your direct experience of being a human being.
Which in and of itself is kind of fascinating. I don't know. I would love to hear more from you on this. My own experience is that there's, for a lot of people, like a pretty great disconnect of what the mind is doing or thinking or focused on versus what the system is asking for. Which, in what I hear you saying, is that, like, if you can be more in tune with, oh, my body is hungry or my system needs rest,
Mhm.
but you know for the people who maybe don't have the context for that or the awareness of it yet, any tricks, tips for how they can start to build that?
To build the awareness.
Yeah.
Yeah, there are many. Mindfulness practice is definitely a really good way of starting with that type of thing. So, mindfulness practice, you can practice mindfulness doing essentially anything. You can practice mindfulness when you're meditating by being mindful of the sensation of your actual breath, or you can find something, an object of focus. It could be your breath, it could be a sound, like if you're putting music on, and just being mindful of like the tones and whatnot. Another way that I really like the description of this is, and I'll use meditation as the first example for practicing awareness, and then I'll go into some other ones. But Alan Watts, who is one of my favorite philosophers of all time, he's a British American philosopher who talked about Zen in a way that was very controversial at the time, because he wasn't necessarily championing the monastic life. He was like, you can live in everyday life society and still be able to practice these things. And when he talks about meditation, he's like, when he's doing like a guided meditation, he'll say, don't try to make meaning out of the sounds.
Mm,
Just allow the sounds of my words to essentially just play with your eardrums. Like, just feel what it's like to hear the sounds, kind of thing. And when we take the meaning or the story out of things, take the opinions out of things, we're able to get very present to our direct experience of reality.
mm,
So ultimately, when we start making a story, if like we were looking at a tree, let's say, and I'm like, that's a beautiful tree, or that's an ugly tree, or that's a tall tree, or that tree has a lot of leaves. All of those things that I've just done are all abstractions of reality, because they're just a description that I'm giving. They're not reality itself, right? So just staring at the tree is that direct experience. Um, I'm using that example because that's currently what I'm doing when I'm meditating these days.
I love it.
It's very pleasant.
Yes.
so, so that's one way practicing mindfulness, right? In terms of bringing the awareness to things like that, is like not trying to give things meaning, but just allowing yourself to experience like wherever you are exactly as it is, without giving it words or anything. The other thing too around practicing awareness and like where I direct a lot of my work is becoming very aware of what emotions you might be feeling. And I think the awareness on the emotions is especially important for human beings because humans are sentient beings. Like we feel a lot and we feel many different things at many different times. And typically we're not just feeling like one emotion. We might be feeling like layers of emotions, like
Mm.
different kinds at the same time. So what I've found to be a really powerful practice for becoming aware of one's emotions is actually from the book Nonviolent Communication, which is not a Zen or a Stoic book, but
Yeah.
certainly some parallels. Um, and nonviolent communication is basically he gives a structure that I think is fascinating because it's about how you communicate your feelings to other people. And essentially the premise is that people don't actually communicate what they're feeling. They communicate their opinions, their criticisms, and their value judgments.
Mm.
And so they're not actually feeling their feelings when they're doing that. They're not telling you what they need or giving you any kind of a solution for how to solve that. So communication gets lost when people are communicating like that. So he creates this structure. Marshall Rosenberg is the author, where he says you first observe the circumstances or the situation exactly as it is. No opinions, no value judgments. Then you talk about how you feel, and what you feel are the actual emotions. So an example of this is sometimes people will say things like, I feel like no one understands me. And that's not an emotion.
Yeah.
We can't feel a concept of
You're right.
don't understand me, right? It's not really real to us as human beings. We can feel hurt, or we can feel sad, or we can feel confused, or we can feel happy, or we can feel joyful or grateful. We can feel all of these things, but when we use like value judgments like that, we take away our awareness from our own selves, and we're getting into not reality, but our concept of reality, which is not, that's essentially what you're subtracting when you're doing any kind of Zen meditation is your
Mm.
abstraction of reality, and you're coming down into like here right now.
Yeah.
So go, what do you observe? What emotion do you feel? What do you need in this moment? Like, so it would be like, I feel, let's say, I like to use this example. So if somebody says, I feel like you never listen to me, right? I'm sure people listening to this have heard that or have used that before.
Yeah.
I feel like you never listen, right? We can't actually feel like someone never listens. But what a person might say in this structure is, I notice that when I tell you about my day, I get short answers back and you seem distracted, or you're not asking questions. When that happens, I feel hurt because I need you to hear about my day and just to listen to me for 2 minutes or something at the end of the day. Can you do that? So the last step is to end with a request for how somebody can fulfill your need. So doing that, I noticed that communicating in that way actually brings a lot of awareness, self-awareness into the emotions and the actual needs that we have.
Mm.
That way we're not using value judgments, opinions, and concepts to try to, in a very distorted way, express to somebody how we feel and what we need, but do
Yes.
so with a way that we can really just understand ourselves better.
Yeah. Um, I really appreciate the focus on what the emotion really is because I think for a lot of people, even finding words to describe emotions that they're feeling can be really, really difficult. To your point, someone might hear that and say, well, no, what I do feel is not heard. But right, but that's not the sense that's being risen up in the system. Okay, so
Mhm.
this I think is a nice segue because I think one of the concepts that I've had an opportunity to, gain a little understanding that you share that I just like cannot wait to share here is this concept around emotional debt. First of all, what is that?
Okay, so yeah, emotional debt is a term that I use that describes the accumulation of unprocessed negative emotions, limiting stories that we have about ourselves, or limiting narratives, things we believe are about ourselves that are not true, incongruent values, so values that we've adopted but not necessarily decided for ourselves, and inner conflict, right? That part of me wants to do this and part of me wants to do that. All of those things consume energy in the system. And emotional debt is us carrying all of that that has not been yet processed, things we've picked up through our lives. And every time we get triggered emotionally by anything, by a person, by something that's said, by an event, anytime there's a trigger, you can think of that trigger as an interest charge on your emotional debt.
Mm.
Because what we're reacting to in the moment, like let's say there's a trigger that triggers the emotion of anger, and the person who gets triggered with anger responds with an 8 out of 10 in intensity when the situation actually warranted a 2. It's not because of the situation. They're
Right.
responding to what happened the first time they felt angry and never processed it. And
Mm.
so that accumulates through the years. And according to the work of Morris Massey, all the full spectrum of emotions has been felt between 0 and 7 years old, which is the imprint period, where we're just absorbing everything like a sponge. So we've felt a full spectrum of emotions in those first 7 years of our lives, which means the root cause of any emotion that you're feeling today happened between 0 and 7. And so we're typically not at all responding to the world as it is right now. We're responding to how we didn't process something maybe at 3 years old and forgot completely that it happened.
Yeah.
And that's where emotional debt starts to take a toll on people's lives, because it has those interest charges, those triggers that cause us to react with poor decision making, procrastination, or emotional outbursts. And that's how it shows up in a person's life. It's kind of like, I like to describe it as, we're all climbing our own metaphorical mountain, right? We're climbing uphill for the ideals that we have in life. That could be a person who's become a new parent, and they're climbing the mountain of, learning and discovering how they could be a great parent. Could be the person who's on a fitness journey or health journey. Could be the person starting a business. But we all have our own mountains. And emotional debt is like climbing the mountain with a weighted sled behind your back.
Mhm.
You can still get up there, but it's going to be very difficult and unnecessarily exhausting. That
Yeah.
is what emotional debt is.
Yeah, and I'm sure that will resonate so deeply, right? Because and I think something that stands out in the examples you gave is that for a lot of people, they're doing more than one of those mountains at the same time. So, right, it's like
Mhm.
the climb is really steep and that load becomes potentially extra heavy because it's not I'm just a new parent. Maybe I'm a parent and I'm climbing, a corporate ladder, or maybe I'm a parent and taking care of an elderly grandparent or parent of my own. Like there can be all these things happening at one time, which I think are for a lot of people become a recipe for those triggers being exposed and the emotional debt to be exposed. What would you say are some of the ways people can start to pinpoint what this debt is, where to start to even navigate for what emotion they are carrying around unprocessed? Like, where does someone even start of identifying what that emotional debt is?
So the best place to identify is the place that people most want to avoid, which are their emotional triggers,
Okay.
right? The emotional triggers give you the biggest clues and indications as to what is not processed within you. Uh, the way that I typically will teach this is through this concept called perception is projection. And perception is projection is essentially this idea that our minds are made to take in 126 bits of information per second. And in the modern age, according to the book Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, that name is always fun to say. It's always a
Yeah.
mouthful. According to that book, he talks about how in the modern age, we get hit with about 11 million bits of information per second, whether that's just like the traffic, the radio waves, the Wi Fi, like the advertisements, everything that's just coming our way. And so if you think about that, 126 bits is like me handing you 126 toothpicks. Like you can imagine what that would be like and you can handle that. And then consciously, we only pick up and focus on 7 plus or minus 2. So between 5 and 9 of those toothpicks are the ones you're actually going to grab, hold on to, and like put your conscious attention on. So
Wow.
imagine 11 million, which can't really even visualize what that would look like, but you're still going to only focus on 126 and still only grab consciously 5 to 9 bits or 5 to 9 of those toothpicks. So the question then becomes, well, then what filters it out? What determines which 126 bits I actually focus on?
Hmm.
And what determines that is your beliefs, values, attitudes, memories, relationships, decisions you made about yourself and about life. That's what's filtering all of it.
Hmm.
So, in other words, you are always only seeing yourself in everything and everyone. And we're always having our own subjective experience. We're never having an objective experience. So, with that being said, in terms of the emotional triggers, if something triggers you emotionally, like if you feel like an annoyance towards somebody, or a thing happens and you feel like kind of yucky about it, the question to ask yourself in those moments that will start to highlight this or bring more awareness to it is, what haven't I processed in myself that is creating this feeling right now? Because there's a lot of work done regarding the conscious mind, unconscious mind integration by Carl Jung.
Hmm.
And Carl Jung would say that until you make the unconscious conscious, it'll rule your life and you'll call it fate.
Hmm.
So that which annoys us most in other people actually has the most to teach us most of the time. And it's not to say that like you are that thing that you're getting annoyed by, but it is to say that there's something within that has not yet been processed yet. And that's your interest charge on the thing that hasn't been processed. So most of the time when, in our modern age, when we get triggered, we want to distract ourselves from it.
Hmm.
We want to be like, okay, let me go do something else. Let me pull up my phone and scroll through Instagram, or let me like fire back and like blame the other person for this thing that I'm feeling right now. And it's not to say like that sometimes those are not functional responses that maybe we just go into, and that's just us being human. But at the same time, if we allow those to persist, we're never going to get the message of what's actually triggering us. So we start through the things that are actually activating us emotionally. Like that's where all the clues are as to what's unprocessed. And if we start there and we talk about the things that really grab our attention most, that's what's going to give us the indication of what to work on.
I'm excited that this podcast is brought to you by mkforhealth.com. Have you been looking for a powerful antioxidant to help support your immune health? Hello, of course we have. Look no further. mkforhealth.com offers an amazing product called Nutrimetrics OPC3. This product is an isotonic capable food supplement chock full of powerhouse antioxidants. Ingredients like citrus extract bioflavonoids, bilberry, grapeseed, red wine, and pine bark extracts, all incredible antioxidants. Then you have the OPCs. The oligomeric proanthocyanidins are bioflavonoids found in fruits, vegetables, and certain tree barks that have exceptional benefit to the human body. Studies have shown that these OPCs are up to 20 times more powerful than vitamin C and 50 times more powerful than vitamin E in neutralizing free radicals. Hello, sign me up for that. Nutrimetrics OPC3 also contains the only isotonic form of pygaginol in the world. Number 1, remember, isotonic, readily absorbed. Number 2, pygaginol, my new favorite word, is a natural plant extract from the bark of a French maritime pine tree, and it is the most clinically researched and potent bioflavonoid found. If you're ready to support your immune health and modulate inflammation in your system, all with incredible powerhouse antioxidants, natural extracts, and ingredients, this is your product. Go to www.mkforhealth.com to purchase your Nutrimetrics OPC3 today. That's www.mk4health.com.
Something that strikes me about okay, so once somebody, let's say, identifies that, the emotion of anger is an issue, for instance, and your reference to when that unprocessed emotion really happened is for many people like um not in memory, right? I mean,
Mhm.
if something happened when we're 2 or 3 years old, we might have no reference point to it actually being an event in our life. How do people start to go back, like march the road back to processing something that maybe they don't even have, a real conscious memory of.
Mhm. So there's a variety of healing modalities that can help a person access these things. And I think you asked a really important question, which is, okay, what about the stuff I don't remember? How do I access that? And most of the time, the root cause of any of these emotions is out of conscious memory. So the tool that I've used and have innovated upon is something called timeline therapy. And timeline therapy was created by Dr. Tad James, and it is a form of therapy that allows a person to eradicate unwanted behaviors by releasing the root cause or all the emotional charge from the nervous system through using their internal timeline. And it uses the concept of essentially building a connection and a rapport with our unconscious mind, because our conscious mind is just the tip of the iceberg. That's what we think we are. That's where the ego is, so to speak, is that that's the conscious mind. That's how we identify the symbol of ourselves. And our conscious mind, for every one bit of information the conscious mind processes, the unconscious mind processes 10,000. So oftentimes where people have some trouble is they're trying to outsmart their unconscious mind, which is not really going to work. It's like, I'm you. So, so the idea is like with timeline therapy, it is a process in which, number one, a person builds a relationship with their unconscious mind. They build a rapport, which most people have never had before in their lives. Like this idea is totally foreign of like, how would you possibly communicate with the unconscious? So timeline therapy gives a person the opportunity to actually build a connection. And the unconscious mind, like another word that I can use for it is like the intuition,
Hmm.
right? And many people have intuition, but oftentimes either they don't trust it or there's so much emotional debt that they can't see the forest through the trees, right? They're stuck in the problems, and the problems are ultimately bound within the nervous system. So through their five senses of how they experience reality, they're just seeing through all of their problems, their stories, and their emotional debt. So timeline therapy gives a person an opportunity to, number one, build that relationship with the unconscious mind, because the unconscious mind stores all memories and remembers everything in exquisite detail. The unconscious mind also represses memories with unresolved negative emotion and will present those memories for resolution when called upon. So once
Hmm.
you've built a relationship with the unconscious mind, you can literally ask it and it will tell you when the root cause is. And so in doing that, if you go back to the root cause of said emotion, right, whether there's anger, sadness, fear, hurt, all those, and you learn what you needed to learn from the emotion, from the event that sprung that emotion about, the emotion disappears, because the only reason why the emotion sticks around is because the emotion is wanting to signal something. Emotions want to be felt and they want to signal some kind of a learning or a message.
Mhm.
And if we don't get that, if we keep resisting the message because we don't process it, if we don't listen, we keep resisting it, it just gets louder and louder, and it will like persist through years and even decades for some people. And it'll just keep going. And until that message has been received or that signal or the emotion has been felt, so to speak, it will just keep going. And so once we learn what we need to learn from it, the emotion no longer has a reason for existing. So the charge dissipates. And because you're dissipating it from the root, it dissipates all the events all the way back until now. And a person is free from that.
I mean, there's a lot of things that come to mind about the link to like epigenetic energy. I don't know, like, is that, if you're, let's say you come from a family where the alpha male has been an angry person, for instance, like if I'm willing to step up and do that work and heal or release, process the energy of that from where it has started in my own timeline, thoughts, experiences, what do you think about how that influences, the systems of the people in your lineage?
So this is a great question that you ask. I'm glad that you did, because I wasn't going to go down this, but now I know this route on this podcast. So Basically, one of the questions that I ask when I'm doing a session with a person and we're releasing their major negative emotions and traumas is I'll ask, what's the root cause of this? Was it before, during, or after your birth?
Hmm.
That question sometimes throws people for a loop because they're like, what do you mean before my birth? Because they don't have conscious memory of it. But oftentimes a person will actually answer with before my birth.
Hmm.
And it might be in the womb. It might be what they perceive to be a past life or previous generation. Some people experience the root causes of some of their emotions as being a generational thing, like you were alluding to. Some people perceive it to be in a past life. Some people perceive it to be in the womb.
Hmm.
One of my most major transformations or breakthroughs with this work when I was sitting as the client for it was actually the root cause of guilt was in the womb for me,
Hmm.
because what my mind essentially told me in that experience is that my perception of the event was when I was in my mom's womb, there was some part of me somehow, some way that knew that she wasn't going to be around for very long. And I took it as she's giving her life for mine. And
Hmm.
so my whole life until I released this was always coming from this place of guilt of like needing to like prove that I was worthy of even being here.
Hmm.
And I was very much a people pleaser. Like the way that it affected me was that it was people pleaser. I would say yes to opportunities and propositions that I didn't really want to do, but I wanted to be accepted and, prove that I was worth existing, so to
Mm-hmm.
speak. And until I released that, that dominated my life. And I didn't even know why. Like
Sure.
it happened from before my birth. And so I've had a lot of clients who would have things that happen in previous generations or in past lives. And whether or not a person believes in past lives is not really of any consequence with this work. And I always will share with my clients to like, if something comes up that you think is crazy or bizarre, doesn't like make any sense, like the historical accuracy is not actually important. What
Hmm.
is important is that's how your mind holds it.
Yeah.
Think about like if you think about consciously like how well and how much detail we actually remember about events in our past, it is horrendous. Like it's not very so if the mind is presenting it, then it's there. And while it might be true, while it might not be true, is not really the issue. The issue is that's how the mind has decided to store it. So that's what we're going to deal with. We're going to deal with what is rather than
Yeah.
what we think it should be.
Yeah, I like that a lot because it removes so much of the judgment and the quote unquote truth of it kind of becomes irrelevant because it just that is what is present and how your whole system is responding to the program that the mind is running. So who cares if it's true or not? Like let's work with exactly what's there. I think that's really powerful. Okay,
Yeah.
I'd love to take this in a couple of like family specific directions just because I think it's, really obvious to see how being willing to do this work could impact, you yourself. But something that's dynamic about family life is that your buttons will be pressed. And for the vast majority of us, we really know how to keep ourselves together in a, quote unquote professional environment, for instance, or be friendly with the neighbors in particular ways, or, we kind of have these guardrails of where we'll let our behavior go. And yet somehow that can all kind of come crashing down in family life. And the triggers will trigger people into different responses than they would have in their outer world. So how might a parent relate to some of this emotional debt and what could be possible for the person who's willing to just go in and do the hard work of dealing with it?
Mhm. That's a great question. It just reminds me of kind of like the joke in psychology sometimes, like, well, why do you treat your kid this way? It's like, well, because my parents treated me this way and then their parents treated them, and like it's going so and so forth. And like, when does it actually stop?
Yeah.
And that's not a really helpful solution or mindset for somebody to have, of just kind of deferring responsibility to, well, so and so treated me this way and then they treated them that way. So what this type of work is it's a generational cycle breaker, right? These things like you were alluding to, if somebody had like a lot of anger in their lineage. And so the way that it relates with parents, I think, is really fascinating because I didn't really realize this. I recently put on my first training to certify people in this work in neurolinguistic programming and timeline therapy. And we do a 6-day training where everybody gets to learn this stuff and they get to experience it as a coach delivering it and as a client. So they get the whole shebang.
Yeah.
And I didn't really realize how effective this was for parents. I knew it was, but it didn't consciously register until I had this training because most of the people in the room were parents.
Hmm.
And like after everything we would do, they'd be like, oh, I can use this with my kids. This would be so good with my kids. And I think what's interesting about it is that the emotional debt and the way that it interacts with a person, especially a parent, is that when their kid does something that upsets them, that triggers them emotionally, that causes them to question themselves of like, am I a good parent? Or like that kind of thing. When they have that experience, typically what's happening is we will disown parts of ourselves and will only allow the parts of ourselves that are ego approved to society to be what we identify as ourselves.
Hmm.
And then our kid will do something that we think is not ourselves and that we've disowned that. And it's somewhere in the unconscious, but the intensity of the emotional trigger shows the degree to which we've repressed that within ourselves.
Hmm.
So our kids have a lot to teach us because they're like little mirrors of all of our repressions, like all of the parts of us that we've repressed. And so a parent doing this work is able to clear their own stuff from their past so that they're not passing on to their kids what their parents have passed to them. And their parents, oftentimes, most of the time, were doing the best that they could with the resources they had available, with the awareness that they had available. And so they didn't know that they were creating traumas. They didn't know that they were creating these experiences of being misunderstood. They were just trying to figure it out like any parent is.
Like all of us are. Yes.
Yeah, or like we all don't really know what we're doing here, but we're doing our best to figure it out.
Yes.
So a parent going through this work is able to break the cycles and not pass on all the stuff that they've had to work on to their kids. They're giving a fresh slate of how they want to parent consciously with the wisdom that they've gained through doing the inner work and allowing themselves to really be there for their kids and not parenting through their triggers, so to speak.
Yeah.
It was fascinating. One of the parents that went through the training, he texted me after the training was done, and he has one of his daughters, and he texted me. He said, for the first time in a decade, I'm able to look at my daughter the same way I did when she was first born, which is like all of this like love and appreciation and gratitude, and no longer like judging her behaviors or like the things that I don't approve of, like her video game habits, and just like be able to like love her as she is without wanting her to be different. And what it allows parents to do to come from that perspective is to create a dynamic where their child feels as though their parent is on their side, that their parent is not this adversary that they need to like try not to get in trouble with, but that their parent is actively on their side and that they can trust the communication that's happening there.
Yeah. Seems like a lot of safety and bonding and like so many things that, our systems are innately looking for can then be present in that dynamic too. I just think that's, super powerful. And don't we all just at the end of the day want to be loved exactly as we are? Like as a parent, I do, there's so much about why it's challenging to do that day after day, right? In family dynamics. And yet this huge opportunity that is right there. It's not easy work. I mean, it can be really uncomfortable to go through processing stuff that you've otherwise spent a lot of energy trying not to deal with. So
Exactly.
I'm conscious of that. It's not
I'm
easy.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. What about for I mean, something I'm really cognizant of is like my kids are not in that, 0 to 7 sponge age anymore. And was I a perfect parent during that time? I mean, I certainly tried my best, but there's, things that I didn't do 100% through that phase for each kid. What would you say to the parent who's like, oh God, I have a
Uh-oh.
13-year-old. I don't have a, 0 to 7-year-old who I can do this work now and make sure it's not part of their environment. What would you say to the person who, has maybe can, from a conscious perspective, say, like, well, I probably have passed a few things on that maybe I don't actually want to, knowing what I know now. What
Mhm.
do you say to
Yeah,
that
I think
person?
that's a great question. I'd say the first thing, first and foremost, for any parent is to do the inner work for themselves first, before they try and create any kind of change in their kids. Because
Mm,
what I've noticed is that kids will do what parents do, not what they'll say.
mm,
And so they're like, I always tell you to do this thing. It's like and yet they're doing something that like you do and you're unconscious of the fact that you do it, kind of thing.
yeah.
So I think the first thing is to set the example and to clear one's own emotional debt before they go and try and like, using like techniques and like new ways of communicating and whatnot. Because ultimately what's going to come out in our tonality and on the words that we choose and in our body language is what's inside, right?
Mm,
What's alive within us. So I think the first thing is to, to do the inner work. And there are so many modalities. I mean, like timing therapy is one of them, but there are so many different things that people can do to create healing in themselves.
yeah.
That's just the tool that I personally prefer and that I teach. So I'm biased. uh, the next thing is that now this is it's interesting because I've actually not talked about this concept related to a parent-child relationship, but I think it actually works with any human relationship. So one of the things that I teach during this training is conscious selling, like the ability to do sales in a very conscious way that leaves a person feeling good and that it is a win-win, like a genuine win-win, not like somebody's like trying to kind of pass it off as win-win, but a genuine
Yeah.
like win between two people, between two parties. Like they want the service, you can provide exactly what they need because you know what they need. So I teach this idea of conscious selling, but there's a core fundamental piece in the conscious selling that is imperative for all human relationship, especially through parent and child. And it is this idea of what I like to call emotional currency.
Hmm.
There's a little theme here.
Yeah, I'm noticing.
So emotional currency is ultimately the degree to which a person feels seen, heard, understood, and admired by another person. So what I talk about in the selling portion, and even as parents, we're selling our kids on when they should go to bed, on how
Totally.
they you're doing this. We're never going to get away from it. So we'll call it influence.
Yeah.
So when we think about it from that perspective, most of the time, at least what I've noticed in observation in parents is that they'll typically just want to say to their kids what they should do. And then they just have the expectation or the fantasy that their kids are just going to listen and just do the thing, just be blindly obedient. And sometimes that can be the case for a period of years where a child will listen blindly and then eventually they won't, and then they really won't listen to anything because everything has been discredited up until that point. So emotional currency is prioritizing that in any connection that you have is to communicate in a way that allows the other person to feel safe, seen, heard, understood, and admired. And there is a way of doing that I have typically taught my clients. I've taught it in trainings as well. That has been really, really effective. And ultimately, the way to do it is to allow the child in this situation to be able to share what they're feeling and what they're experiencing without any kind of like judgment or criticism, but just like listening intently and showing them that you understand and that you hear them, sort of thing. The way that I have taught it in like a practical manner that somebody can like take and listen to this podcast and actually apply is I call it the three voices of communication. And at any one point, we can be speaking in any one of these voices. And in natural, normal conversation, we kind of flow through all of them. But sometimes when people put on the parent hat, in other words, they unconsciously are like, okay, I'm in parent mode now. I have to be the authority, which is the first voice. The first voice is the authority, and the authority is ultimately just telling someone how it is. You're just imposing your beliefs, your opinions, your judgments. The second voice is the voice of the peer. And the intention of the peer or the friend is to find commonality, to relate, to see what you have in common, to show you that like I'm like you. That's what the friend is trying to do. And then lastly, you have the student. And the student is just wanting to better understand through sincere curiosity. And sincere curiosity is the key phrase there.
Yeah.
Just wanting to understand from like an accusatory place does not work very well. So the tonality is everything, but the sincere, I really be curious about this. But most of the time, what I've noticed is just that many people will fall into the voice of the authority because they think that that's where like they have the most strength and they have the most influence. Is like, okay, I'm just gonna be like the strong presence. I'm just gonna like tell them how it is, and that's it. It's like when you go into that voice, typically what you're gonna meet with is resistance, especially if there's no rapport. Like if there's no rapport and somebody just goes in. This is the example that I like to use. So let's say I had a client that called me and they're like, Victor, I want to lose weight. I just don't have like, I want to lose weight. I want to go to the gym. I want to go to the gym 5 times a week. I just don't have the time. If I was the authority, this is how I might respond. I'd be like, that's not true. You do have the time. You're not prioritizing it. I'm probably right about that. But they don't care because
Yeah.
that doesn't feel very good.
Right.
Right?
It's hard to hear.
So
Yeah.
I've immediately broken rapport and any kind of connection. Like I've lost my opportunity for them to listen to anything that I had to say because I didn't give them a moment to feel understood and heard. So that's how the authority might respond. The peer would respond with like, hey, I totally get that. Like a lot of the time, I think it's, it's tough to prioritize. What I noticed though is that it's not that I didn't have the time to go to the gym. It's that I wasn't prioritizing it. And then once I did that, then it really helped me. Totally different feeling when we speak like that, right? Because now we're sharing and relating to the experience instead of telling them how it is, telling them their experience. Nobody wants to be told what they're experiencing or feeling. Then you have the student, which is, I would say, oftentimes the most powerful and the most underutilized, especially in parenting, which is to seek to understand through sincere curiosity. So let's say they said the same thing. I want to go to the gym. I just don't have the time. The student might go, you don't have the time? Just pose a question. Like, is it really that you don't have the time, or has it not been a priority yet? Right? So this curiosity that gives the ball back.
Yeah.
So the way that might work in parenting is instead of just telling them like what to do, you use questions. Maybe relate a little bit.
Yeah, I love that because I mean, even in my own experience, like there are times where, I can have that voice with myself, even, right? Of like,
Yeah.
just do the thing, right?
Yeah.
You know what to do, blah, blah, blah. And if I can even just ask myself a question of like, what is it about that makes me feel like I'm not capable, or I'm not ready, or, whatever, the thing that feels like it's preventing me, that in and of itself can shift my own, and that's in my own head. So I can only, right, imagine the way that shifts somebody else's experience of, just knowing that they are seen and can feel and be exactly what is, because they're the authority on themselves, right? Even our young
Yeah.
kids, they know what they're feeling. They know what's underneath of that. And if we can just give space to ask that question of like, what is that for you? They'll probably have an answer. It's just,
100%.
I love that. It's a total flip on, kind of what is shown as the parenting dynamic. So I really, appreciate that so much.
Of course. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. I mean, I could really just keep going down a big rabbit hole here, but I feel like this is probably a good place for us to put a pin in it for today. What, where would people go to find out more about you and the work that you're doing? If they have questions about what the heck is emotional debt and how I get started on this work, where should they look?
So the best place to go is my website, which is training.zenstoic.com. And there, that whole page talks about emotional debt, how it affects people. And if somebody's interested in learning more, that page also gives an opportunity to jump on a calendar call with me and discuss, how the best strategies for ridding yourself of that emotional debt and creating that life of liberation.
Yeah, liberation. That's one of freedom is one of my favorite words that comes to mind in coaching work because when everything starts to become a choice, oh, that's like a real yummy place to be. Like, what? I
Oh,
get to choose
it's
everything. This is amazing.
right. The most powerful tool that we have, or the most powerful resource we have, is our own choice.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. Well, thank you, Victor, so much for joining us today. Really appreciate the conversation. I really appreciate the way to not only start to kind of identify this in your own system, but then how it can get expressed in families and what we can do to start shifting that. So I'm really grateful for that. And yeah, I look forward to having people check out how they can start to rid themselves of the emotional debt. Because gosh, when we first had a conversation, the thing that came to mind, there's the expression like "don't cry over spilled milk," right? Which is something that kind of gets, I think, at the situation is a 2, but the response was an 8 kind of vibe. And I didn't share this with you yet, but the thing that came to mind is the way it is expressed in youth sports these days. And that has become sort of this like quote unquote safe haven for people to like let their emotional triggers fly everywhere. It's like really a wild
Oh yeah.
dynamic in youth sports. I can't think of another arena where it's socially acceptable to have these emotional triggers that just fly all over the place. And are vocally shared with other people.
But
So,
Little League can be a really dicey place.
oh my gosh. Huh. So that could be another place for people to look. Like, how do you feel when you show up at your child's, 4th grade soccer game? If that feels like all the stakes are on the table, like that could be an interesting place to start to look for where the emotional debt
Feels like
might
the
be.
World Cup,
Oh my gosh. Oh, I tell you. But anyway, thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate it. And we will catch everyone next time.